Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Mother's Day is just around the corner, so today I'm excited to share 3 handmade Mother's Day card ideas with you. So let's dive right in. To make the first card, I folded a rectangular piece of brown cardstock in half. Then I cut another piece of watercolor paper that was a little smaller than the brown card. Before gluing it down, I marked the area where I wanted to paste it. Next, I put masking tape along all the 4 edges of the watercolor paper. I dipped a brush into water and used it to spread the water on the paper to dampen it first. Then I mixed together crimson and white watercolor to achieve a shade of pink and applied the paint onto the wet paper. I tried to smooth out the paint as much as I could to get a uniform wash of watercolor. Once the initial layer had dried, I applied a second coat of paint to deepen the color. After the paper fully dried, I took this floral stencil and taped it to the paper to secure the stencil, ensuring it doesn't move during the painting process. Then I dipped a foam brush into red watercolor paint and lightly dabbed the foam brush over the stencil. I was trying not to apply too much pressure to avoid paint seeping under the stencil. Then I carefully lifted the stencil away from the paper. To paint the remaining area, I matched the stencil with the pattern on top and taped it down. I continued filling in the entire stencil design with the watercolor paint, ensuring even coverage. After that, I removed the stencil and peeled off the washi tape to reveal the white border. I adhered the paper to the brown card with a glue stick. While sticking it, I paid attention to the pencil markings I drew before as a guideline to ensure even spacing around the edges. I took a piece of black cardstock and wrote Happy Mother's Day on it using gold Sharpie. Then I cut each word into small rectangular pieces. To equally space them out, I drew 3 parallel lines at the bottom right corner of the paper. After that, I glued all the 3 pieces down following the reference lines. So this completed our first DIY Mother's Day card. To make the next card, I folded a 9 by 12 inch watercolor paper in half. Next, I took a brown paper and folded it, leaving a small overhang on one side. So we want it to be big enough to accommodate the little folds I plan to make on both sides later. I marked where I was going to fold the paper, made another fold at the bottom of the paper and cut out the extra. I made a crease along the overhang that I marked before. Using a glue stick, I spread the glue evenly on the little flap. After that, I folded the edge on the left towards the flap on the right and pasted the flap over it. Then I folded the bottom edge of the paper upwards, creating a crease about 2 to 3 centimeters wide. I opened it up and made 2 triangular folds at the opposite sides. Again, I folded the horizontal flap on top in half and made a crease. Next, I folded the bottom flap, slightly overlapping the top flap, and creased the fold. I opened it up again and applied glue on the tiny triangular areas at the bottom. After adhering them, I applied glue on the triangular sections on top and along the fold at the bottom. Next, I folded the flaps outwards, creating a crease along the bottom. Then I made 2 small folds on the left and right of the bag. I opened them up and made creases on both the sides like so, and our paper bag was almost ready. I wanted to make it a little more short, so I cut off the extra length. Then it was time to add a handle, so I used a ruler and pencil to mark 2 points, ensuring they were evenly spaced out and at the same height. Using a hole punch, I punched a hole at each marked point on the bag. For the handle, I cut a piece of faux leather cord. I inserted one end of the cord through one of the holes and tied a knot on the inside to secure it. Then I inserted the other end of the cord, adjusted the handle to the desired length, and tied a knot. I snipped the excess cord and our little paper bag was ready. Next, I drew some tulips with a pencil on a piece of watercolor paper. I also added a pair of leaves. I drew 5 tulip flowers and darkened their outlines with a black waterproof pen. I erased the pencil markings and moved on to coloring them. To color the first tulip, I mixed crimson and white watercolor for a pink shade. Using a clean brush, I applied water within the pencil outline to dampen the paper. This will help the paint to blend easily. Then I dipped the brush into the pink color to paint the tulip. I chose to paint the next tulip using a soft purple watercolor, blending crimson, blue, and white. To paint the next one, I used yellow watercolor. For the next tulip, I started by painting the edges, mixing a bit of orange and white watercolor. Then for the center, I used some yellow and blended it in. I I painted the last flower with a pinkish purple color. Then I let the paint to dry completely. To enhance the depth of the tulips, I opted for a darker shade of the base color, added shadows, and then used a damp, clean brush to blend any harsh edges. To paint the tulip leaves, I mixed a dash of brown with green watercolor. I applied this color to the stem and leaf edges, then used lemon yellow watercolor in the center to blend it in. I used a fine brush to add details like veins on the petals and some more shadows to give depth and dimension. I painted the veins using a darker shade of the petal color, following the natural pattern seen on the tulip. I used a darker shade of green to add details and shadows to the leaves. Then I used a damp brush to blend any harsh edges. I used a pencil to draw outlines following the shapes of tulips and leaves, keeping a consistent spacing around the edges of the painting. Then I carefully cut along the marked lines using a pair of scissors. After I cut out all the tulip shapes, I grabbed a thin strip of brown cardstock to fit inside the bag. Then I applied a small amount of glue to the back of each tulip stem and pasted them one by one onto the rectangular piece. I glued the flowers at the center slightly higher compared to the ones at both the ends. I was trying to maintain a consistent spacing between each flower. This step is optional, but I cut out a similar strip of brown paper and pasted it on top, aligning it with the rectangular piece underneath. I applied glue on the back of the strip and pasted it inside the paper bag like so. Then I cut a rectangular piece of white cardstock and wrote "Love You Mom" on it with a black marker pen. Using a ruler, I drew border along the edges of the paper. Leaving a little gap from the bottom, I drew a straight horizontal line on the paper bag as a guide. Then I grabbed the piece of paper and using a glue stick, I pasted it onto the bag following the guideline. I placed the bag of tulips on the card and marked the area where I wanted to paste it. After that, I cut a piece of double-sided tape, stuck it to the back of the paper bag, removed the protective layer on top, and attached the bag to the card. So this is how our DIY bag of tulips card turned out. To make the last Mother's Day card, I grabbed a 9 by 12 inch sheet of watercolor paper. To start off, I drew a straight line to divide the paper into 2 equal parts. Using this line as a reference, I folded the left side of the card inward, aligning its edge with the reference line along the center, and then I made a crease. I repeated the same process for the right side of the card as well. Then I grabbed a pencil compass, placed it on the reference line, and drew an arc on top of the card. Following the outline I drew, I cut it out with a pair of scissors to get an arched door shape. With the help of a ruler, I drew a frame for the door that was 1 centimeter wide. I free-handed the arched frame, following the semicircular shape while trying to maintain a uniform width throughout. I marked out 6 panels of equal length on the door, then I began cutting them out with a pair of scissors. You can also use a craft knife to carefully cut along the marked lines. After cutting out the panels, I traced the frame again onto the inside of the card using a pencil. I tried to create a wooden effect on the door using watercolor. For this, I mixed golden brown, dark brown with a small amount of black and green to create the base color of the wood. Then using a round watercolor brush, I painted densely packed vertical lines of various lengths on the frame. Taking a damp, clean brush, I blended them in a little bit. I didn't blend them too much since I wanted the texture to be somewhat visible. Following the same process, I painted the door panels as well. After the base coat dried, I added some black to dark brown watercolor paint. I dipped a dry brush into this darker shade of brown to paint thin streaks along the grain pattern to mimic the natural variation in wood. If you feel like the streaks look too harsh, you can blend them in just a little bit with a clean damp brush. Then it was time to paint the view from the door. First, I dampened the paper with a layer of water. While the paper was still wet, I applied blue watercolor to a brush and painted the outer edges of the cloud formations. Then I used aqua watercolor to paint some parts of the sky. I used some white to soften the paint a little bit. I used a hue of purple on the sky and used the same purple to add shadows under one of the clouds. I blended it in with the tiniest amount of orange watercolor. I mixed some white and yellow and painted small cloud-like shapes at the bottom of the sky. To add more depth, I used orange watercolor and blended it in. After finishing the sky, I applied a light wash of yellow paint to the bottom half of the card. Then using red paint, I painted a set of poppy flowers. Next, I painted some purple and yellow wildflowers. I was reducing the size of the blooms based on their proximity to the horizon. The flowers in the front appeared to be the largest, while those near the horizon were the smallest. To paint the horizon, I mixed blue and green watercolor. I added a little amount of brown to green paint and painted grass-like strokes with a round brush. Just like the flowers, the grass strokes appeared to be the largest at the front and smallest near the horizon. With dark green watercolor, I painted the stems of the flowers. I also added leaves to some of them. To enhance the depth of the wildflower field, I applied a layer of dark green grasses to fill in any gaps. Then I decided to add some blue flowers as well. I painted a few small hills on the horizon with bluish-black watercolor. I also added some more details to the flowers, like painting the center of the poppy flowers black. I dipped a fine brush into dark brown paint to add the final touches by outlining the frame and the panels. This completed our last DIY Mother's Day card. I hope you enjoyed these ideas and found some inspiration to create your own DIY cards for Mother's Day. Please hit the like button if you found this video helpful and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.